They tell you fear has a smell. They're wrong. Fear has a temperature. It's the cold that climbs up through the soles of your shoes when you're standing somewhere you were never meant to stand, in a house that was never meant to let you leave. I know this because I lived in that cold for 11 months. I know this because I loved the man who made it. And I am telling you this story now, in the dark, the way it should be told, because some of you will recognize the shape of it before I'm finished. Some of you have already met a man like Damiano Rocca. You just didn't know yet what he was going to cost you. My name is Wren Ashby, and before all of this I restored books for a living, not paperbacks. Not anything you'd find on a shelf at an airport. I worked with things that were older than the countries that made them, vellum gone soft as old skin, ink faded to the color of dried blood, spines that cracked if you looked at them wrong. I like the quiet of it. I liked that books don't lie to you the way people do. A damaged page tells you exactly how it was damaged: water, fire, a careless hand, time. There's an honesty in decay that I have never found anywhere else. I did not know then that I was about to meet a man who had turned that same principle into a philosophy of violence. Damiano Rocca believed that everything broken tells the truth about what broke it. He believed this about books. He believed this about people. He was right both times, and it nearly killed me to learn it. It started with my father's debt. I want to say it started with something more elegant than that, a mystery, a letter, a stranger's face across a room, but the truth is uglier and far more common. My father borrowed money from men he should never have gone near, men who exist just outside the light of the law, in that grey country where interest doesn't accrue in percentages, but in favours, in silence, in flesh. He died before he could pay it back. Grief has a way of making you stupid, and I was stupid enough to think that death erased debt. I found out otherwise on a Tuesday in October, when a black car the length of a hearse idled outside my apartment for 11 straight hours until I finally walked out to it, because staring at a thing that patient eventually becomes worse than facing it. The man who stepped out wasn't Rocca. It was one of his, a broad, quiet man named Nico with a scar through one eyebrow, and the kind of stillness that comes from having killed people and slept fine afterward. He didn't threaten me. That was the first thing that told me how serious this was. Men who only want to scare you shout. Men who intend to collect whisper. Nico told me very softly that Mr. Rocca had a proposition, and that it would be better for everyone, myself included, if I heard it in person. I remember the smell of the car's leather interior, expensive and suffocating, and the way the city lights slid past the tinted windows like something dissolving. The estate was called Villa Corvo, Crow's house. I didn't understand the name until much later, when I learned what he kept in the East Wing. But even on that first night, driving up the long unlit road through iron gates that opened without anyone touching them, I understood that I had crossed some kind of threshold that did not lead back out the way it led in. The road ran for almost a mile through black pines before the trees finally opened onto the grounds themselves, and I remember pressing my palm against the cold glass of the window, watching the headlights catch on things I couldn't quite place: a low stone wall, a dry fountain, something that might have been a family chapel with its door boarded shut. There was no moon that night. There didn't need to be. The house rose out of the dark like something built to be seen only by the people it chose to let in: pale stone, black shutters, windows lit gold on the ground floor and utterly dark above the second story, as if the upper half of the house had simply been switched off, or had never agreed to be seen at all. Somewhere off to the left, I heard a dog bark once, low and warning, and then nothing. The silence that followed it was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and I understood before I'd even stepped out of the car that this was a house that had learned to keep its silences the way other places keep their light on. I met him in a study that smelled of cedar, gun oil, and something sweeter underneath, cloves maybe, or old tobacco gone soft with age. He was standing at the window with his back to me when I came in, which I would learn later was deliberate. Damiano Rocca made you wait for his face the way other men make you wait for a verdict. When he finally turned, I understood in one long cold drop through my stomach why grown men in that city lowered their eyes when his name was spoken. He was not what I expected. I expected a monster, something obviously wrong, some visible cruelty stitched into his face. What I got instead was worse. He was beautiful in the particular way that a blade is beautiful, purposeful, precise, utterly without apology for what it was made to do. Dark eyes that didn't blink often enough. A voice when he finally used it, low and unhurried, like a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. He knew my name before I gave it. He knew my father's name, my father's debt, the exact address of my apartment, and the fact that I hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, which he mentioned the way another man might mention the weather. I felt in that room like one of the manuscripts I restored, already read, already catalogued, my damage already understood by someone who had simply been waiting to acquire me. Before he spoke, he crossed to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of something the color of dried roses, and he set one in front of me without asking whether I wanted it. The way you'd set food in front of an animal you were still deciding whether to trust. His hands, I noticed, were a laborer's hands wearing a wealthy man's rings, scarred across the knuckles, a thin white line along one thumb that looked like it had been made by a blade rather than an accident. He caught me looking. He didn't explain it. He only turned the glass slowly on the desk in front of him, watching the liquid catch the lamplight, and said that most people who entered that room made the mistake of speaking first, as if silence were an emptiness that needed filling rather than a test they were already failing. I said nothing. Something in his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more the memory of one, and he seemed, in that small stillness, almost pleased with me, the way you'd be pleased to find a book that had survived a fire better than you expected. His proposition was simple, and that was the horror of it, how simple it was, how reasonable he made it sound. His family had come into possession of a library. Old books, older ledgers, correspondence going back 3 generations, much of it in Italian, Latin, and a private cipher his great-grandfather had used to hide the names of men he'd killed and the debts he'd forgiven. Rocca wanted it catalogued, translated, made legible. He wanted, he said, to know exactly what he owned. I would live at Villa Corvo for the length of the work. My father's debt would be forgiven in full. I would not be permitted to leave the grounds without escort, would not be permitted to bring a phone with a working camera, would not, under any circumstance, go into the East Wing. I should have run. I want you to understand that I knew, even then, standing in that cedar-dark room with his eyes on me like a hand pressed flat against my throat, that I was being offered a cage dressed up as a kindness. But debt makes cowards of all of us, and I said yes the way you say yes to gravity. Not because you want to fall, because there was never really a version of this where you didn't. The first week I told myself it was simply a job. I told myself this while unpacking a single suitcase in a bedroom larger than my entire apartment, its windows facing a garden gone wild with black roses that no one seemed to prune. And I told myself this while a silent, iron-spined housekeeper named Mrs. Albrecht showed me the servants' halls and the kitchen and the library, and said without any inflection at all, that the house had rules the way a body has bones, and that rules, like bones, were what kept a person standing. I asked her what happened to people who broke them. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look you give someone you've already decided to pity, and said only, "Ask him, not me." Then she walked away, her keys singing softly against her hip, and I stood alone in a hallway so long the far end disappeared into shadow, and I understood for the first time that I had entered a place that measured time differently than the rest of the world did. It was Nico, of all people, who showed me the grounds the next morning, walking a half-step behind me with his hands loose at his sides in a way that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd kept them visibly near a weapon. He pointed out the garden wall, the old stables converted to a garage for cars I never once saw driven, the chapel with its boarded door that I'd glimpsed the night before, and when I asked him why no one used it, he said only that some rooms in that family got retired the way certain words did, once they'd been used for something that couldn't be undone. He showed me the rose garden last, and I understood, standing at its edge, why I hadn't been able to place the colour the night before from the car. The roses were black, not a deep, near-black red the way some cultivars are, but truly black, bred that way deliberately, I would learn, by Rocca's grandmother, who had planted them the same year she buried a husband killed in a war that had nothing to do with soldiers. Nico told me, with the flat delivery of a man reciting a fact he'd repeated many times, that no one pruned them, that they were left to grow wild on purpose, because Rocca believed a thing that had been forced into beauty wasn't worth keeping, and a thing that grew dangerous and lovely entirely on its own terms was the only kind of beautiful he trusted. I remember thinking, standing among those black flowers with the morning fog still low on the grass, that he could just as easily have been describing himself. My bedroom, when I finally had a moment alone in it, told its own quiet story. The furniture was old, good, cared for in the particular reverent way that objects are cared for in houses where money has stopped being the point of anything. There was a fireplace that worked, laid with wood I never saw anyone bring in, and a window seat that looked out over the black roses, and a lock on the door that I noticed that first night could be turned from either side. I lay awake a long time considering the significance of that. A lock that could be opened from outside wasn't a lock at all. It was a courtesy, extended for exactly as long as it suited the person who'd installed it. The library itself was the only room in that house that didn't frighten me. 2 stories of dark wood shelving, a rolling ladder, the smell of leather and dust and old paper that I have loved since I was a child, and for a few hours each day I could almost forget whose house I was standing in. I catalogued first editions worth more than most people's homes, working through the mornings while the light came in low and gold through the eastern windows, and I'll admit there were hours at a time when I forgot to be afraid, absorbed instead in the particular pleasure of coaxing a 200-year-old spine back into a shape it could survive being opened in. It was in one of those absorbed hours, running a hand along the underside of a shelf to check for water damage, that I found the seam, a panel that gave slightly under my fingers where the wood should have been solid, and behind it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a stack of ledgers written in a private cipher. The cipher itself was almost beautiful, in the cold way that codes built to hide murder are sometimes beautiful. A substitution system layered over a second, older Sicilian dialect, so that even once you cracked the first layer you were left staring at words that still refused to mean anything until you found the key to the second. I spent 4 nights on it before the numbers finally resolved into names, columns of them, dates beside each one, sums of money that didn't correspond to any legitimate transaction I could imagine. Some of the names were crossed through in ink gone brown with age, a single decisive line drawn through each, and I remember running my thumb over one of those lines and feeling, without yet understanding why, that I was touching the edge of something final. It was in the 3rd week that I found her name for the first time. Isabel, written in the margin of a ledger in handwriting that wasn't the same hand as the rest of the entries, smaller, more hurried, almost frightened, as if whoever wrote it had done so quickly, between other tasks, afraid of being caught in the act of writing at all. Isabel, the margin said, and beneath it in the same hand, he doesn't sleep when the wind is from the east. I remember sitting very still with that ledger open on my lap, feeling the hair rise along my arms, because I understood instinctively that whoever had written that note had not been cataloguing history. She had been leaving a warning, the way you'd leave a message in a bottle, not knowing if anyone would ever read it, only that she needed, desperately, to have said it somewhere. I asked Mrs. Albrecht about Isabel over dinner, which I ate alone most nights at a table built for 20, my voice swallowed whole by the size of the room. Mrs. Albrecht's hand stopped moving, just for a second. Then she resumed clearing my plate, and said that she didn't know the name, in a voice so carefully flat that I understood she was lying with the practiced skill of someone who had lied about this exact thing many times before. Raka began joining me for dinner after that first month. I want to describe those dinners to you the way they actually felt, because I think this is the part people misunderstand about men like him. It was never the violence that pulled me under. It was the attention. He had a way of listening that made you feel like the only surviving artifact in a museum, the one thing worth the electricity to keep the lights on. He asked about the ledgers. He asked about the books I'd restored before this, about my father, about whether I'd ever been in love, and he asked all of it in that low, unhurried voice, leaning back in his chair with a glass of something dark red held loosely between two fingers, watching me answer the way you'd watch a fire you'd started on purpose, curious to see how far it would spread. One of those dinners has stayed with me more clearly than the others, the way certain rooms stay lit in memory long after the rest of a house has gone dark. It was near the end of the first month, and he'd asked, out of nowhere, between courses, whether I had ever wanted anything badly enough to do something unforgivable for it. I told him I didn't think I had. He set his glass down very deliberately and said that he envied me, that genuinely envied it, the way another man might envy someone their health. He said that wanting something badly enough to become unforgivable, for it was the only kind of wanting he'd ever really understood, and that he'd stopped, a long time ago, expecting to feel anything softer than that. I asked him carefully, testing the ground the way you'd test ice, whether he regretted it. He looked at me for a long moment across all that gleaming silver and candlelight, and said that regret was a luxury for men who still had the option of becoming someone else, and he had made his choice too young, and too completely, for that door to still be open. Then he asked me in the same even voice whether I found that frightening. I told him the truth, which even then surprised me more than it seemed to surprise him, that I found it frightening the way standing at the edge of a cliff is frightening, not because you're afraid of falling, but because some small, dishonest part of you is afraid of how badly you want to jump. He didn't say anything to that. He only watched me with an expression I couldn't read yet, not then, though I would learn to read it very well before the year was over, and he refilled my glass himself instead of letting the staff do it, which I understood, even that early, was its own kind of answer. There was a night, early in the second month, when a storm came in off the coast and knocked the power out across half the estate, and he found me in the library by candlelight, trying to keep the humidity from warping a 17th century binding. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the doorway, his shirt open at the collar, rain damp, watching me work with an intensity that made my hands unsteady. When he finally spoke, he said that he liked watching me handle old things as though they could still be hurt. I asked him if that surprised him. He said it did. He said most things in his life had already learned they couldn't be hurt any worse than they already had been, and it was rare to find something or someone that still flinched. I felt that sentence land somewhere low in my chest, somewhere I didn't want to admit to, because he was looking at me when he said it. Not the book. Me. That was the night I first understood the shape of what was happening between us, and I want to be honest with you about how it felt, because sanitizing it would be its own kind of lie. It felt like standing too close to a fire in winter, the kind of heat that's dangerous precisely because it feels so good against skin that's been cold for so long you forgot what warmth was supposed to feel like. He crossed the library floor toward me slowly, unhurried the way he did everything, and stopped close enough that I could smell him, leather, gun oil, cloves, and beneath all of it something warmer, something that was simply him, some chemical signature of danger that my body responded to before my mind had the sense to be afraid. He reached past me, not touching me, and closed the cover of the book I was working on, his forearm a bare inch from my collarbone. And he said very quietly that some things should be handled with gloves, and some things were worth the risk of bare hands. Then he stepped back, and the moment broke, and he told me to get some sleep before the damp ruined anything else, and I stood there in the candlelight for a long time after he left, breathing like I'd run somewhere. The nights got harder after that, not because of him, because of the house. I started hearing things in the walls, not mice, not pipes settling. I know the difference. I'd lived in old buildings my whole life. This was footsteps. Slow ones, deliberate ones, moving along a corridor on the floor above my bedroom. A floor Mrs. Albrecht had told me on my very first day did not exist, that the house had only 2 stories, that the upper windows I'd seen dark from the driveway were simply attic storage, unused, unheated, not worth my curiosity. But I had counted the windows from outside, and I had counted the stairs inside, and the numbers did not agree with each other, not even close, and there is a particular kind of dread that comes from catching a house in a lie. The nights themselves had a texture in that house that I have never encountered anywhere else before or since. It wasn't only the footsteps. It was the way sound traveled through those old walls, warped and distant, so that a door closing 2 floors away could reach my room sounding like it was closing directly behind my head. It was the cold spot just inside my doorway that never matched the temperature of the rest of the room, no matter how high Mrs. Albrecht kept the heat. It was the way the black roses outside my window seemed, some nights, to lean toward the glass, though I told myself, every single time, that it was only the wind. One night, close to 2 in the morning, I heard something that I have never fully been able to explain away. A woman's voice, thin and far off, singing, not words I recognized. A lullaby, maybe, or something that had once been a lullaby before time wore the meaning off it. I lay in bed with my heart slamming against my ribs, and I told myself it was the wind through a cracked window. I told myself it was a maid with the radio on low. I told myself every reasonable thing a frightened woman tells herself at 2 in the morning in a house she does not own and cannot leave. And then the singing stopped, all at once mid-note, the way a record stops when someone lifts the needle. And the silence that followed was so total, so absolute, that I understood the singing had not stopped on its own. Something had made it stop. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay very still and listened to the house breathe around me, and somewhere near dawn I heard, very faintly, a door close on the floor above, the floor that did not exist, and then footsteps unhurried, descending a staircase I had never once seen. I confronted Rocker about it 3 days later in the garden among the black roses, because I had decided that fear was a worse companion than the truth, however ugly. I asked him what was above the 2nd floor. I watched something in his face go very still, very controlled, the particular stillness of a man deciding in real time how much of himself he was willing to let me see. He told me that some rooms in a house are like some rooms in a person, locked not because there's something dangerous inside, but because there's something unbearable, and the lock is a mercy, not a punishment. I asked him if Isabel was behind that lock. I watched him go pale beneath that olive-dark skin, the first time I had ever seen him look anything less than absolutely in command of himself, and for one long, suspended moment, I thought he might actually answer me honestly. Instead, he asked me very quietly where I had heard that name. I told him about the ledger, about the margin note, about the handwriting that wasn't the same as the rest. He was silent for so long that the wind had time to move through the roses twice before he spoke again. And when he did, his voice had lost all of its usual unhurried confidence. He said that some names in that house were not meant to be spoken by anyone who did not already understand the weight of them, and that if I valued anything about the arrangement between us, I would let the dead keep their silence. Then he walked away from me across the garden, and I stood among the black roses with my heart going too fast, understanding that I had just watched something break loose in him, some old grief wearing the mask of a threat, and not knowing yet which one of those two things was actually the truth of him. The attack came 2 weeks later, and it is the reason I am telling you this story the way I am, because until that night I still believed I understood the shape of the danger I was in. I did not. It began with the dogs. Villa Corvo kept 3 of them, enormous black shepherds that patrolled the grounds after dark, and I woke near midnight to the sound of all 3 of them screaming, not barking, screaming, a sound I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. And then silence, worse than the screaming had been. I got out of bed. I don't know why. Every instinct I had told me to lock the door and hide beneath the covers like a child, and instead I found myself pulling on a robe and moving toward the window, some old animal curiosity overriding every ounce of good sense I had left. I saw men crossing the lawn. 6 of them, maybe 7, moving low and fast, the particular economical movement of people who have done violence before and expect to do it again tonight. I understood, watching them, that this was a rival family. I would learn later they called themselves the Basils, old enemies of the Rockers going back 2 generations, men who had been waiting a long time for an opening this good. And then the house exploded into motion around me. Lights coming on, shouting in Italian and English both, and my door burst open without a knock. And it was Nico, blood already on his shirt sleeve, telling me to move now, follow him, don't stop for anything. I remember the hallway lit by gunfire from somewhere below, strobing the walls white, then dark, then white again. I remember the smell of cordite, sharp and chemical, cutting through the cedar and dust of that beautiful, terrible house. I remember Nico shoving me into a windowless room off the library. A panic room, I understood later, one of several the house had been built with, because a house like Villa Corvo was never simply a home. It was a fortress wearing a home's clothing. And I remember the door sealing behind me with a sound like a held breath finally released. And then I was alone in the dark, listening to a war happen through 8 inches of reinforced steel. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the gunfire eventually stopped, and the silence after it was somehow worse, because silence after gunfire could mean anyone had won. I heard eventually footsteps outside the door, slow, dragging, and a hand against the steel, and Rocca's voice, low and rough in a way I had never heard it, saying my name. Just my name. Ren. Like he wasn't sure until he heard himself say it that I was still real. I opened the door. He was covered in blood, and for one terrible second I couldn't tell how much of it was his. His shirt was torn open at the shoulder, a wound there dark and still bleeding, and his hands, when he reached for me, left red marks against the pale fabric of my robe. I should have flinched away from him. I want you to understand how strange it is, to look back now and recognize that in that moment, drenched in violence, standing in a hallway that reeked of blood and gunpowder, I felt something in me settle rather than break. He was alive. Whatever else was true, whatever this made me, he was alive, and some fierce, unreasoning part of me was glad of it in a way that had nothing to do with sense. I made him sit while I found the med kit Mrs. Albrecht kept in the kitchen, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, and I cleaned the wound at his shoulder while he watched me with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain. The room was very quiet. The house, finally, after everything, had gone still around us, and it was just the two of us and the low lamp, and the smell of antiseptic fighting, a losing battle against the smell of blood and cordite in him. I remember the exact moment his hand came up and closed over mine, stopping me mid-motion, the gauze still pressed to his shoulder, and he said very quietly that he had almost lost the one thing in that house that hadn't been touched yet by everything he was. I asked him what he meant. He said, "I think you already know." And then he was closer than he had ever allowed himself to be, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off him, close enough that the blood and the cologne and the low animal scent beneath both of them filled every breath I took, and his hand came up to my jaw, careful, almost reverent, the way you'd touch something you were afraid your own hands were too rough for. He didn't kiss me. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the almost was worse and better than the thing itself would have been. He stopped a breath away, his forehead nearly against mine, and he said my name again, low, like it cost him something to say it and not follow it with anything else. And then Mrs. Albrecht's footsteps sounded in the hall, and he pulled back, and the moment closed over like water after a stone. It was 2 nights after the attack that I finally went into the East Wing. I am not going to pretend I did it out of courage. I did it because I could not sleep, because the house's silence had become its own kind of noise, because I had spent a month listening to footsteps on a floor that did not exist, and I had reached the particular breaking point where knowing the worst felt safer than continuing to imagine it. Raka had left for the city that night, some business I wasn't told the details of, and Mrs. Albrecht had retired early, and the house, for the first time since I'd arrived, felt almost unwatched. I took a candle from the dining room, because I did not trust the sound of a flashlight switch in that silence, and I found the staircase behind a section of library shelving that swung outward on a hinge, so well-oiled it made no sound at all. The staircase was narrow, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and I climbed it with my heart going so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The walls pressed close enough on either side that my shoulders nearly brushed them, and the air smelled of dust and something underneath the dust, something floral gone slightly wrong, like flowers left too long in stale water. My candle threw shapes ahead of me that kept almost resolving into figures before dissolving back into shadow, and twice I stopped completely, certain I had heard breathing that wasn't my own, before forcing myself forward on legs that did not want to cooperate. At the top was a corridor, and along that corridor were doors, 6 of them, all closed, all except one at the very end, standing very slightly ajar, candlelight already flickering faintly from within, as if someone had left a lamp burning for a very long time, waiting for someone to finally come and see. The room was a girl's bedroom. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with the room itself, because nothing about it made sense until it made horrible, complete sense. A narrow bed, made up with a coverlet gone soft and faded with age. A dressing table with a silver brush and comb laid out exactly, precisely, the way you'd set a table for a guest who was expected any minute. A wardrobe full of dresses in a style 20 years out of fashion. And on the wall, a portrait, an oil painting, done with real skill, of a girl no older than 16, dark-eyed, dark-haired, with a face that shared enough of its bones with Damiana Raka's face that my breath caught before I even understood why. Isabel read a small brass plate beneath the frame, and beneath her name dates. She had died at 17. I stood in that doorway for a long time, candle shaking slightly in my hand, piecing together what I was looking at and grief, when I finally understood it, felt so much larger and so much sadder than the horror I had braced myself for. This was not a captive's room. This was a shrine. Someone had kept this room exactly as it must have been the day Isabel died, dusted it, aired it, replaced the flowers in the vase on the windowsill. I could see they were fresh, no more than a few days old, and someone had done this, I understood with a cold certainty, for years. The footsteps I'd heard at night were not a warning. They were a ritual. Someone climbing that narrow staircase in the dark to sit with a girl who could no longer sit with anyone. I heard him before I saw him. His voice came from the doorway behind me, rough with something I had never heard in it before, not danger, not command, but grief, raw and unguarded. The sound of a man caught in the one room in the world where he had never expected an audience. "She was my sister," he said. "And they took her from me when I was 19 years old and she was 17. And I have spent every year since making sure that the men who did it paid a debt they will never finish paying, because there is no currency large enough to cover what they cost me." He told me the rest standing in that doorway, his voice low, stripped of every ounce of performance I had come to associate with him, and I understood, listening, that I was finally seeing the man beneath the empire, a boy who had lost his sister to the Basil family in a war over territory that had nothing to do with her, who had watched his father do nothing, who had taken the family's business into his own hands at 20 years old, specifically, so that no one who mattered to him would ever again be unprotected the way Isabel had been unprotected. He told me the singing I'd heard at night was a recording, an old one, the only recording that existed of her voice, that Mrs. Albrecht played it sometimes because she had loved Isabel too, and could not let the sound of her disappear from the house completely. He told me the crossed-out names in the ledgers were not simply debts forgiven. They were men who had been in the car that night, and the crossing out meant they no longer existed to be collected from, in any sense of the word. I asked him very quietly, standing in his dead sister's bedroom with a candle guttering in my hand, whether he had brought me to that house to catalogue his books, or to fill a room that had been empty far too long. He didn't answer that directly. He said only that he had not expected, when Nico first mentioned my father's debt, to feel anything at all about the woman attached to it. He said that in 11 months of watching me work, of watching me handle broken things like they still mattered, he had felt something come loose in him that he had bricked over the year Isabel died, and that it terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced, because enemies could be killed, and this could not. I understood in that moment that I had walked into that house believing the greatest danger in it was him, and I was leaving that room understanding that the greater danger, the one I had truly never seen coming, was how much I had come to want to stay. The Basils came back one final time, 3 weeks later, and this is the part of the story where I have to ask you to understand that the line between rescue and possession is thinner than any of us like to admit, thinner than I understood until it was tested against my own life. It happened at night again, because men like that only ever move under cover of dark. And this time they came prepared for the panic rooms, prepared for Nico, prepared for everything except the one thing they hadn't accounted for, which was how far Damiano Rocca would go for something he had finally allowed himself to call his. I was in the library when the first shot came through the window, close enough that I felt the wind of it against my cheek before I understood what the sound had been. I want to tell you I was brave. I was not. I was on the floor with glass in my hair and my heart trying to climb out through my throat, and the last clear thought I had before instinct took over entirely was that I did not want to die in that beautiful, terrible room without ever telling him what I'd understood in his sister's bedroom, that I had stopped being afraid of him weeks ago and started being afraid only of a life that didn't have him in it. He found me there. I don't know how in a house that size in the middle of a war, but he did, and the look on his face when he saw the glass in my hair, the blood on my hands from crawling across the broken window, was not the look of a man protecting an asset. It was the look of a man who understood in real time exactly how much he had to lose, and had decided, with the terrible clarity of someone who has already made peace with any cost, precisely what he was willing to do about it. What happened after that, I am not going to describe to you in detail, because some things are not mine to make entertainment of, even now, even in the telling. I will tell you that it was over within 20 minutes. I will tell you that Damiano Rocca did not simply survive that night. He ended it completely, in a way that meant the Basil name would not trouble that house again for a generation. And I will tell you that when he came to find me afterward, in the aftermath, his hands were red again the way they had been the first time, and this time I did not clean his wounds. This time I crossed the space between us myself, glass still in my hair, and I kissed him the way you kiss someone when you have finally stopped pretending you don't already belong to them. He asked me later in the quiet after, with the house finally, truly silent around us for the first time in 11 months, whether I understood what I was choosing. He said it plainly, without performance, without the low, unhurried confidence I'd first met in that cedar-dark study. He said that loving him meant loving a man with blood permanently under his fingernails, a man whose enemies would always eventually come looking, a man who had built an entire fortress out of grief and violence because it was the only architecture he knew how to survive in. He said I could leave. He said, and I believed him, that he would let me, that he would give me money and a new name and a life 1,000 miles from any house with a wing that didn't officially exist, and that he would never come looking, however much it cost him not to. I told him that I restored broken things for a living, and that I had never once, in all my years of doing it, found a single object worth saving that hadn't first been shattered by something. I told him that I understood now, standing in a house that kept the memory of a dead girl the way other houses keep photographs on a mantel, that some of us don't get to choose between safety and love. We only get to choose which danger we're willing to live inside of, and I had already made my choice the night I climbed a hidden staircase, looking for a ghost and found, instead, the whole aching truth of the man I'd fallen for. I still live at Villa Corvo. I want you to know that, because I think it changes the shape of this story to know how it ends, rather than leaving you to imagine some rescue that never came, some escape I never made. The East Wing is different now. Isabel's room is still kept, still dusted, still fresh with flowers, but the door stands open now instead of locked, because Damiano finally let himself grieve her in the daylight instead of only in secret, at 2 in the morning alone. There is a portrait of me now, too, hanging in the upstairs hall, commissioned without my knowledge and unveiled on the 1-year anniversary of the night I first walked through those iron gates. I stood in front of it for a long time the first time I saw it, understanding exactly what it meant to become the second name in a house that keeps very few things, but keeps them absolutely forever, the way it kept its books, its ledgers, its dead. Some nights, when the wind comes in off the coast the way it did that first stormy evening in the library, I still hear footsteps on the floor above mine, but I know now whose they are, and I know where they're going, and some nights I climb that narrow staircase myself and sit for a while in a dead girl's room with a candle burning, keeping a vigil that isn't mine to keep alone anymore, because grief, I've learned, is easier to carry when someone finally lets you carry it beside them. People ask me sometimes, the few people left in my life who still know how to find me, whether I'm afraid, living the way I live now, loving the man I love. I tell them the truth, because I promised myself I would always tell the truth about this, even the ugly parts, even the parts that don't make me look like the heroine of my own story. I tell them that fear never left, it just changed shape. It stopped being the cold thing that climbs up through your shoes in a stranger's driveway and became something closer to reverence, the particular fear you feel standing very close to something powerful enough to end you, and choosing, every single day, to stay standing that close anyway, because the alternative, a life without that fire, without that danger, without him, had stopped, somewhere along the way, feeling like safety at all. It had only ever felt like the cold, and so I stayed. And the house kept its silence, and its ledgers, and its portraits, and its women, and I became, willingly, one more name it would never let go of. I think about my father sometimes, still, in the quiet hours when the house lets me have them. I think about the debt that brought me here, and I wonder if he ever imagined, in his worst nights, that the men he owed would end up giving his daughter something he never managed to give her himself, a place where she was seen completely, damage and all, and kept anyway. I don't say that to excuse any of it. I want to be careful about that, because I think it would be easy, telling this story, to let the ending soften everything that came before it, and I don't want to do that to you. Damiano Rocca is exactly the man I have described to you tonight. The blood under his fingernails is real. The enemies are real, and they will keep coming, the way tides keep coming, indifferent to how tired you are of them. I have made my peace with a life that will likely end violently, sooner rather than later, because that is simply the arithmetic of loving a man like him. And I made that peace with my eyes open, which is the only kind of peace worth having. What I did not expect, walking up that unlit road for the first time with my heart in my throat, was how much of myself I would find in that house's dark corners, not lost, the way I feared, but recovered, the way you recover a page you thought had been damaged beyond saving, only to discover, once you finally have the patience to work the stain out of it, that the words underneath were legible all along. Some nights I still hear footsteps on the floor above mine, and some nights I climb the stairs myself to sit with them a while. And some nights, the good ones, he finds me there first, and we sit together in a dead girl's room with a single candle burning, saying nothing, needing nothing, and I understand in those hours that this is what I was always going to choose, long before I ever had the words to explain why. If you ever find yourself standing outside a gate like that one, in a car idling too long, in a cold that climbs up through your shoes, I won't tell you to run. I'm not sure anymore that running was ever really the answer. I'll only tell you what I wish someone had told me. Know exactly what you're walking into before you decide it's worth staying for, because some houses don't let you leave, and some of us in the end never really wanted to.